Sense of control, connection, and meaning. Trauma overwhelms a system that gives us the capacity for these three things. And the key to any intervention is to restore the system that makes it possible for them to experience these again. My name is Reyes from UCSF Child Trauma Research Program. And the goals for today, for this training, is to give an overview of interpersonal trauma, how it impacts young children, including their brain development, social, emotional development, cognitive development and learning, preschool success. And I'll also address the insidious impact trauma has on relationships and the key to helping people find a path towards recovery. This training is not limited to mental health staff in whatever role you're in. If you're working with parents or families, you can have a tremendous impact on promoting empowerment, hope, and safety. I want to start with just standing in awe and respect for the miraculous body, mind, and brain and our systems to be able to respond to stress and danger. Our physiological reactions to feeling frightened include an increase in heart rate, which pumps more blood to our muscles and organs to be able to flee if you can or fight. The blood flow includes also in your brain a shift in blood flow from the cerebral cortex to lower, more primitive areas of brain. Again, it allows for heightened sensory perception to be able to fight or flee what's the threat that is in front of you. But it's at the expense of other parts of the brain that help you be able to solve complex problems. Also, your breathing quickens, blood pressure elevates, even the digestion is impacted and it turns off. Again, to prioritize resources elsewhere, it's incredible, all that your body does the moment that you feel at risk or frightened. The brain also experiences changes when threatened, mostly regulated by the HPA axis. When there's a signal of danger, the brain releases chemical messengers to the hypothalamus, which releases hormones that trigger the pituitary gland. Mostly adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline increasing your heart rate, dilating your pupils, getting you ready. Cortisol increases blood pressure, blood sugar, regulates your metabolism and immune response. This is really key. All of this brilliant protective system is intended to be temporary, with a return to a calm state baseline. All these resources are prioritized to the expense of everything else, including health, immunity. But it's not meant to be chronic. It's not meant to be a pervasive way of being, of life. For many families that we work with, when we ask them and assess for traumatic events, many of them just express it being a way of life or not really being able to identify each event, but it's just the way it is. They're constantly on this state of an alarmed protective system. It comes at a great cost. When the body produces too much cortisol, the immune system is compromised, and there's a lot of studies, most recently the ACEs study, that show that stress is associated with all sorts of, almost all health problems. There is a breakdown in the body's stress response system when it's overused and when it never returns to a calm state. And it really impacts the person's capacity to regulate internal states over time. Emotional regulation becomes one of really the key factors that is impaired and that we would seek to intervene at. Traumatic events, as I mentioned earlier, overwhelm the system that gives us a sense of control, connection, and meaning. I will talk about the post-traumatic stress disorder and common symptoms that people experience after witnessing or experiencing or having your caregiver experience traumatic events. And I will also talk about these more insidious, pervasive impact to the way that one makes new relationships. Because I think this is really where it's at and often can be overlooked. It's really beyond the symptoms that we know of PTSD, where the impact lies. This protective structure to chronic trauma has a big cost in the ability to form new relationships to many people and have a expectation that future relationships, including the one you'll be trying to build with them, will inevitably fail, frighten, or abandon them. And the only sense of being able to have control of what they believe will inevitably happen is to cause it. What you may see, how this may show up, is rejecting services or blatantly pushing you away or not showing up for sessions, dismissing the value of services. All this is a normative reaction to a protective structure that is being very carefully built. We've also noticed an assumption of a shortened life or a hopeless future, expecting that the future will be more of the same of what they have experienced so far. And for chronic, complex trauma, a lot of that has been so painful and hopeless. So what you may notice, how this may show up, is self-destructive behavior or difficulty following through with services, feelings of indifference, emotional detachment, just giving up initiative or giving up the struggle. If you notice these things, and these are the things we mostly hear about when we consult with case managers, mental health professionals, or really any workers trying to help families move forward, these are the things we hear that they struggle with. Is how do we understand this behavior that parents or clients have? How do we move forward with it? How do we work with it? And I really think it becomes one of the biggest obstacles to the people who most need the help to be able to access the service, connect, and receive it. What I encourage you to do is, when those things come up, is to just notice it. To notice it and contextualize it as part of a sequel of reactions, adaptations to a life of complex chronic trauma. Notice it when it happens, respect it, because it has kept them alive until today. And then at another time, try again. Find another port of entry. Try a different way. Don't give up. What has been disrupted in many people who have experienced trauma is this basic sense of trust. And that is at the core, the foundation for any new relationship. Many people say they feel utterly alone, cast out, alienated from other humans, outside of the human experience. They have a deep devastation that they almost can't attach to words, really. Just images, senses, feeling detached, a deep disconnection. And this colors every new relationship that they will build, including the relationship they will build with their children and with you. You will notice themes of autonomy, competence, intimacy, identity, initiative. All of these are themes that may be challenges within relationships. They may be more prone to shame and self-doubt, and ultimately they just do have difficulty modulating intense emotions. It's one of the key ways in which it shows. So the classic post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, which initially was a sequel of symptoms that we thought described more of a single incident trauma, and I will speak about how this contrasts to complex trauma, but the original PTSD has now 4 clusters of symptoms, one being re-experiencing, which may look like intrusive thoughts, images, nightmares. For children, it can be intrusive play sequences that play out the trauma they've lived, distress at reminders. The next cluster is avoidance, avoiding any reminders of the trauma. And since most traumatic events happen within the context of interpersonal relationships, almost all interpersonal encounters can be potential reminders. So avoiding reminders can often be becoming completely disconnected or cast out from all relationships. Another thing that may happen is numbing, just numbing from whether it is becoming very well at the skill of dissociation or using substances to numb, but just being disconnected from the emotional experience and decreasing interaction with others, since often they can be reminders. The next cluster is arousal. This can look like insomnia, irritability, hypervigilance. They may have a very high startle response, may do things that seem aggressive, reckless, self-destructive. And the fourth new cluster is negative cognitions and mood, which is this persistent, distorted sense of blame of self and others, estrangement from others, diminished interest in activities, or sometimes inability to remember key events of the event. Sometimes we see people who remember to detail the event but have no affect attached to it. And other times, in contrast, we see people who have a lot of dysregulated feelings, images, but have no coherent narrative to attach it to. Two different things, different ways to adapt to it. And then there are new two subtypes that have been added, the preschool subtype for children 6 and under, and then the prominent dissociative symptoms ones, which I see is the most prevalent with complex trauma. Experiences of feeling detached from one's mind or body, or feeling like the world seems unreal or distorted, dreamlike. It's actually very common. So that is PTSD as it stands in the DSM. What we mostly see at our clinic and the community aging sites that we bring child-parent psychotherapy to is complex trauma, is what's referred to in the literature as complex trauma, which is more multiple, ongoing traumatic events. Most cases, they include exposure to repetitive childhood sexual, physical, psychological abuse or family violence. And they're often in the context of coexisting emotional neglect. We have found a very strong association between coexisting emotional neglect or insecure attachment with these types of abuses. So the PTSD diagnosis I described only captures a limited aspect of that. It's the traumatized child and adult's complex self-regulatory relational impairments is really what you will what you may see presented, and it really is a template. It's a roadmap of all future relationships that are impacted, and I think this is it's the highest cost that is paid by experiencing trauma. Other differences between single trauma and complex trauma is that single trauma tends to be limited exposure, and most of the time it's a commonly it's an external threat to an otherwise intact system of a family, which implies that you have the support of some adult to help you navigate through whatever it is that the traumatic event caused, whether it is community violence or any other external threats. The onset tends to be later in development, and it tends to be associated with secure attachment. What's different with complex trauma is that it tends to be multiple exposures of different types of trauma, and often within a multiply already stressed system. Like I mentioned, more associated with insecure attachment, the onset tends to be earlier, and often it is the same person, the caretaker or the primary attachment figure, that is both a source of threat and at times love, which makes it incredibly confusing and disorganizing for young children. Mediating factors, this is a really good question that we always would like to know is, what could mediate what could help us buffer the great cost, the great impact of complex trauma? Some of those factors are the relationship to the abuser. The closer one is to the abuser, the worse the outcomes. Others is the types of trauma, and the more intense or invasive the trauma is, the type of trauma is, then the worse the outcomes. Losses associated with the abuse, as there often are, there's rarely just one event. It's often followed by subsequent losses. So if the initial event, say, was witnessing violence in the home or child abuse, often it's associated with then separation from parent and child, or then loss of employment, homelessness, etc. So it's what other losses were associated with it. What was the reaction of the grown-ups to the child when they first disclosed, if that's the case? And what is the age of the child at the first trauma experience? Counterintuitively, the earlier the onset of trauma, the younger the child is, the worse the outcomes, which often is a big myth that people may think that the younger children, you may hear parents say, don't understand, didn't really witness it, they were sleeping. All those things are understandable wishes that parents have. And I think you need to connect with that wish first, but also inevitably help parents see that actually it may be their youngest children that have been the most impacted. Other mediating factors are community safety. What is the context? Is there poverty? Are they experiencing new traumas in the community? Do they feel threatened there? And then here's a mediating factor that's very hopeful, is the best predictor of outcome for children. The outcomes for the children following a traumatic event is the caregiver's ability to cope with the event. And that is very hopeful for us, since hopefully you're in a role in which you're helping parents recover from the events that they've experienced and eventually help their children recover from it. And the best place, if you want to help a child, is to help their parent, and research confirms that. Types of trauma, I've already mentioned some, and some I think are the most obvious. Experiencing or witnessing violence in the home, child abuse and neglect in all its forms, experienced or threatened. It's really the environment of a threat, of fear, that causes all these physiological and emotional changes, not necessarily always the actual act. It's enough to always be on threat. But then there are other types of trauma that often go overlooked, and I want to highlight them. One is a sudden separation from a caregiver, especially in early childhood. Being abruptly separated from a caregiver in a stressful context, whether it be deportation or incarceration, is considered a type of trauma. It is directly threatening their livelihood if they are not with their primary caregiver. Another one that goes overlooked is community violence. Living in a place where there are school shootings, violence in a school community, lockdowns, sounds of gunfire from the home, loud fighting or assaults while you're in public transit. Any of this unpredictable, threatening behavior has a great cumulative impact, even if there aren't particular incidents. Feeling frightened in your own home or community, or witnessing your parent being frightened, which is really in and of itself the same as you being frightened if you're birth to 6, has an insidious impact on families and communities, and it can be overlooked. And many times families don't present it as a stressor. Many times they just adapt to it and haven't really paused to see the cost of that adaptation, what they really have to do day by day to survive a chronically chaotic or threatening environment in their community. There's also a constant state of fear and helplessness, especially for communities that have historically and still are disempowered. For people of color who experience institutional racism by so many organized systems, including many systems that you may be interfacing with, CPS, the police. There's, of course, the intergenerational transmission of trauma that Alicia Lieberman speaks of so often, in which a parent's unresolved dynamics and dysfunctional, often coping strategies and relational style is passed on to the next generation unconsciously. But then there's also the intergenerational transmission of community trauma, such as the post-traumatic slave syndrome, in which communities prepare their children for the world that they have had to live in. And until that world changes and interacts with them differently, these children are giving a roadmap by their families of what's needed to survive an unjust, biased world. So for African American, Black boys and Latino boys, that what can be seen as a symptom of PTSD and that hypervigilance is required, or is seen as required by their parents, and their need to have those skills to survive. So just want to name it, just want to name that this broader context in which many families live in promotes a lot of what's being discussed today as symptomatic. This sense of disempowerment, disconnection, the imbalance of power and control is worth naming and reflecting in ourselves. What can we do to help families feel empowered, feel connected? What is the antidote of that? What can shift that pervasive and so detrimental dynamics? So now I will move on to talking specifically about children birth to 6 and their impact when exposed to violence and trauma. The study that you see here is striking to me. I don't use a lot of statistics because for every report that you see or every article that you see, you'll see different statistics. I think the bottom line is that it is so prevalent and that only a small percentage of what happens really even gets reported. But this statistic in particular I wanted to share because as we know, there's varying degree of awareness by investigating officers of how the little eyes, the little ears in the room, how much are little kids seeing? And even within that, even acknowledging the varying degree of training, 81% of children in the home at the time of an incident were found by officers to have seen or heard the event. That's striking to me. Children under 6, are overrepresented statistically in homes with intimate partner violence. They're more at risk, more vulnerable. So how are young children, birth to 6, impacted by intimate partner violence and trauma? Young children develop in the context of relationships. So it is within these relationships, in that primary caregiver relationship, it is within that they really learn all that makes us human and be able to succeed in the world. They learn to regulate their physiological response. They learn to form internal working models or templates, roadmaps as to what relationships are, who are they in a relationship, what can they expect from relationships. And within this relationship also, they are provided a secure base for exploration and learning. Without that secure base, it really impairs their ability to continue in the course of development and move forward into exploring and learning. And it also models accepted behaviors and social learning. All of this happens within that relationship. So if that primary relationship, if in that they develop a sense of relationships being unpredictable, scary, punitive, or confusing, such as in intimate partner violence, in young children who are chronically exposed to violence and trauma, this brilliant defensive structure that I have presented, which is already vulnerable at their age and immature, is not really able to sufficiently cope with such stressors. They can neither escape or the flight response or fight, resist the adults in their life. And even disconnection, the freeze response, which is often their only available strategy, will not be successful at keeping them safe. So what often happens is that this protective system disintegrates and disorganizes. These are important words, disintegration and disorganization, because when we think about what we can do, what is your role to intervene in whatever role you're in, these are two things that they desperately need: integration and organization, so that they can integrate and organize internally, integrating the trauma narrative, which I'll talk a lot about, of how to integrate that narrative, and how to organize themselves internally. And what that often means is emotional regulation. Let me shift a little bit in thinking about our brains and how trauma impacts brain development. Our brains, of course, change and adapt over the course of our lives, and I like to know that because it gives some hope. I think what I'm about to share could feel really grim for parents whose children have already been exposed. But what I like to couple this information that I'm about to give you with also hope that our brains are always regenerating, our cells are always regenerating, and because of that, there's always room for healing. But it is true that the critical window of development is between birth and 3, but really you can extend that to 5 in terms of brains. Neuroplasticity, which is the process in which our brains are shaped by experiences. There are 2 types. Synaptic plasticity, which is the strength of connections between the brain cells, and then cellular plasticity, which is the number of connections between brain cells. This is the only time, it's unique in the course of our life, that both types of neuroplasticity are taking place. And because of that, this critical age of development will likely have lasting impact if it's not treated over the course of their lives. In a way, it's like trauma is toxic, literally toxic to brain development. As my colleague Chandra Ghoshaipan says, it wires the brain for danger. There's an overactivation of the amygdala, which is the area responsible for assigning emotional meaning to what you're taking in from your senses. And this changes the way it manifests itself as increased fear and anxiety. There's also an underactivity of the anterior cingulate of the medial prefrontal cortex, which is the area whose job it is to extinguish learned fear responses. So all these things are really, really critical. There's a loss of brain cells, a damage to brain cell connections, an enlargement or shrinking of certain parts of the brain. It's fascinating. Changes to the hippocampus, which can lead to impaired memory and mood control, two things that you'll also see impaired with trauma. And then there are changes to the prefrontal cortex, which results in difficulty focusing. It can result in poor memory, critical thinking. Here is a PET scan I want to show you that contrasts a healthy brain to an abused brain of children who had been in orphanages in Romania and had experienced profound neglect. As you can see, there is a marked difference in the temporal lobes. So it's the actual structure of the brain is altered. I want to share with you a fairly recent study about interparental conflict and its impact on infants' emotional processing. They took a sample of 6 to 12-month-old infants, and half of them, the control group, weren't necessarily exposed to interparental conflict, and the other was exposed to moderate interparental conflict. And while both samples were sleeping, they used a functional MRI and noticed that the babies who were typically exposed to interparental conflict had very different brain activity across several brain regions that are implicated with emotion and stress reactivity and regulation, a lot of the things that we see as impacted with trauma. So more and more we find there's a robust literature that continues to confirm all the layers of impact in early childhood when there's exposure to violence and trauma. We see increased aggression and externalizing problems, increased level of depression and poor self-concept, impaired social interactions and peer relationships, delayed cognitive development, poor academic functioning, sleep disturbances, fear of being alone or separating from a caregiver. There's a long list of the cost of adaptation, and especially a child who's not in a situation in which they have really any control. The costs are very high. What does a child have to do to adapt to a climate of chronic abuse and trauma? It requires one, constant alertness, constantly scanning for warning signs, being overly focused on the mood, facial expressions, the voice of the grown-ups around them. We also see a frozen watchfulness, efforts to avoid abuse by becoming immobile, invisible, almost non-existent. They may try to regain control of the situation by being either overly compliant or try to construct a system of meaning that justifies the horror that they live. So that includes blaming themselves and believing that they must have an innate badness, then that must be the cause. It's really an effort to protect this delusion that a caregiver could be whole and good. And also it fits with where they are developmentally in that they see the world as revolving around them. And so any bad thing that happens around them must be their fault. In the course of healthy development, children develop a secure sense of self by forming inner representations of their caregivers. And then eventually they learn to evoke these images when they're in distress. But when development is distorted by trauma, the inner representations of their caregivers are fragmented. They're confusing, they're split. And since this is the foundation for personality formation and emotional regulation and a sense of identity, three things that are so key in development in early childhood, really who they are in relationship to others, all that's impaired. To talk a little bit more about cognitive development, it's been linked to learning and behavior problems. So difficulty in the following areas: language, communication, problem-solving skills, executive functioning, regulating emotions, and peer and teacher relationships. If you go down that list, you will see that that is exactly all you need to be successful in preschool. It's also linked to an increase in impulsivity and aggressiveness. May have a difficult time following directions, concentrating, sitting still. These are the things you'll hear about from preschool teachers. And these are the very things that promote a very high rate of preschool expulsion. And we're seeing more and more what a travesty really it is, especially for African American and Latino boys who are expelled 2 to 3 times as likely. The national preschool rate is 3.2 times the expulsion rate for K through 12. So the very kids that really need and already starting a school experience behind because of their early experiences in the home, the very people that need our system to buffer them up and get them ready for kindergarten are the very kids we're failing, because they're the kids that really don't function, aren't equipped to, already set up to fail, because they don't have the skills to be able to be successful in preschool as it stands now. Continuing and ending this piece on the brain and the thinking brain, you'll see on your slides, this is a picture of our thinking brain. A lot of what we need to make the decisions that our society, the skills that our society values to be successful happens here, the prefrontal cortex. And what happens to our brain when we're afraid? We literally do not have access to the prefrontal cortex. Because once we take in the signal that there is danger, that there is fear, our brain, the chemistry in our brain, changes so rapidly, as I expressed earlier, the first slides today, of all that happens in our brain and our body, to be able to fend off whatever we experience is threatening us, whether it's an experienced threat or an emotional threat or an actual physical threat. All these changes that happen in our chemistry, in our brain, and our body, do not make it possible for us to think, for us to have access to critical thinking, to learn. Children who are constantly using that primitive survival brain, who really need to access that part of the brain to survive and have no access to the prefrontal cortex, will have a very difficult time learning at school, making the types of decisions we want them to learn to make. One of the saddest ways that trauma impacts young children is in their play, in their peer relationships. Play should be renewing, constructive. It should be flexible. It's the one place really where children can experience a sense of control and mastery over their life, and they use it to make sense of their world. They can experiment with alternate endings, different roles. It should be fun. It should be flowing. It should be a natural way of being for children. What we often see with children who have experienced trauma is that it impacts even their play, and that it is flooded with the life experiences they've had that get reenacted in this compulsive repetition in play. There is a very clear link between play and what happened. There's a failure to relieve anxiety. They tend to either, and with peers, they tend to either be, not all, but some we see are either excessively withdrawn and shy, or they are aggressive and end up frightening other children, which doesn't make it easier for them to make friends. So often it is another area of development that is impaired, is peer relationships and the way that they express themselves. I'll talk more about play and interventions, because it can be, and it is the most natural medium to connect with children and kind of enter their world a little bit. But it is sad when either they don't play, or their play is so constricted and so flooded with all the trauma they've experienced. Lastly, the saddest way in that children are impacted by trauma is the way that their relationship with their caregiver is distorted. It shatters the developmental expectation that children need to have, that they can be protected from their primary caregiver, from their attachment figure, especially when the protector becomes the source of danger. It forms an unresolvable fear. There's nowhere to turn, and a confusion about what's safe and dangerous. It leaves the child with contradictory feelings about the parent, who sometimes, I want to acknowledge, are also loving. There's no one that's 100% one or the other. A parent who keeps them, who gives them some things that they need and keeps them alive, and there is love there, but that also can be frightening. Forms a very contradictory paradox of in a relationship with a parent, which then sets the template for future relationships where you will see this paradox again, and I'll refer to it later. Another thing that happens is that a lot of times the traumas are experienced by both parent and child. And either partner may develop negative attributions based on the trauma experience toward each other. I think the best example of this comes from our dear Patricia Van Horn, who talked about a family, a mother who came in an emergency shelter with a child in arms and a 3-year-old, and I apologize if I'm not remembering the story accurately, but what was the take-home message for me is that this mother walked in the shelter distraught. You could tell on her face that she had just been battered. Understandably very upset, and so were her children. She walks in and talks about what had just happened to her and almost reliving the experience of being battered. As she's talking, her, from what I remember, a 3-year-old little boy becomes triggered and is remembering himself what happened, and it shows in his body. He becomes dysregulated, very active, disorganized, and trips on something and falls and cries and approaches the mother like this, which to many of us may be a plea for comfort. But to this parent who had just been battered, the way she interpreted it is when she saw her son come at her that way, she said, "Don't hit me." I think this is the saddest way in that trauma impacts families. And I think this is why, and I'll talk more about intervention, it's important to treat the whole system, to treat the parent and the child together because they've both been impacted. This mother could only see aggression. She couldn't see the plea for comfort from her son. She had just only experienced violence, and he reminded her of that violence. I'll talk more about interventions, but since I'm sharing this example, I want to put a little plug that for many people hearing this story, the initial reaction is, what's the matter with that mom? And I think understandable reaction, again, notice it. Just notice it in yourself. Be curious about it. Don't judge yourself for it, but don't intervene in that moment. Because if you're in that place where you're thinking, what's the matter with that mom? The next thing you say, I guarantee you will not help that parent move forward. You really have to get to a place where you can see the best in the other yourself. You have to get to the place where you can really see and understand and contextualize the behavior of the family you're working with before you intervene. So for this mother, the fact that this child expected that she would hold him, to me is very hopeful. It tells me that this child at 3 years old has not learned that the parent is not a place to go to for comfort. He has not given up. He's not a child withdrawn that is expecting the parent wouldn't comfort him. He was expecting that she would have, which to me tells me she has done that in the past. The general pattern is that she has been able to provide him that, and in this situation she couldn't. She couldn't see past the violence. It's not just a question of what's the matter with that parent. It's what happened to that parent and what happened to that child that could have distorted this relationship that innately is set up to protect and love each other. What could have happened that could have distorted that? And I think you really have to see that, believe that that can be restored before you intervene, because it's very easy to fall in the trap of judging the parent. If you don't understand a behavior, pause, wonder, question yourself, and just, as Patricia Van Horn used to say, sit in your hands and wait. That's just a little plug. We'll talk more about interventions in a bit, but I like to fit in a little hope because it is quite a bit of this presentation is acknowledging the impact of trauma, and I know that that can be a downer, to say the least. So the caregiver and child serve as traumatic reminders of each other. He reminded her of the violence, and often children are also reminded of the violence they've seen within the relationship with their parent, especially if it happened by them. To complicate matters further, if the parent has been traumatized themselves in their own childhood, if they've experienced any type of interpersonal or complex trauma that's unresolved, untreated, their ability to establish and maintain an empathic relationship with their child will be impaired, which just further makes the job of parenting even more difficult, which is an already difficult task. they may have a decreased capacity to recognize danger or stress. One thing I've noticed in parents is their radar for stress and danger is impaired. So they either may over-attribute danger and be very anxious in their parenting and expect that their child will face danger and distress at every turn, or they may not accurately attribute danger where it's necessary and inadvertently placing their family in situations that continue putting them at risk. So that radar of knowing what's safe and dangerous can be distorted, which obviously will impact their parenting. Another thing that can make parenting difficult is if you don't get enough sleep, which happens a lot in the first few years. And even here, people with PTSD have a disadvantage in that they take longer to fall asleep. They awaken more frequently during the night than people without PTSD. So again, it's this rewiring of the nervous system. If you see a parent who's coming in and they have not gotten any sleep and they have untreated PTSD symptoms, that is the place to start before we wonder what's happening with their parenting. Another thing to notice about the insidious impact of trauma is that there's a lot of really exciting research showing that trauma lives in the body. We have muscle memory. The physical body retains a memory of what the mind experienced. The brain and nervous system retain that and reenact it in some way. It's in the way people live, carry themselves. It's very insidious and important to note, especially as we think about interventions, because I think the growing body of literature on body-based interventions is really exciting, and it can be something that anybody in any profession, not just mental health staff, can promote in parents. It can make a huge impact. Continuing with memory, traumatic memories are encoded in a different way. So they lack the verbal narrative often, or the context, and are just flooded with imagery and bodily sensation. When in doubt, body interventions is one place to start. There was a study done by, well, a few, but one by Lenore Terre of 20 children in early childhood who experienced a traumatic event before the age of 2.5. And 18 out of the 20 exhibited showed their traumatic memories in play and in their behavior, even though they didn't have a verbal narrative to it. Babies do remember. Trauma memory is encoded in a different way, but it lives there. We've seen this time and time again in our clinic, where children who experience physical abuse at 6 months and are coming to treatment and they're now 3 years old, they're showing us in their play an uncanny accuracy of where they were injured, and showing us on the dolls to how their arm was twisted. Or it's really amazing. What we see keeps confirming that what happens to us, what happens to all people when they're little, lives in them and stays in them, and it needs to be addressed and treated.